Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the 6th CBHA-ACHA talk that we've been putting on during the pandemic. It's been a pretty successful venture so far. My name is Dimitri Anastakis. I'm the chair of the Canadian Business History Association, and I'm very happy to be the moderator for this session. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Andrea Benoit, as she presents and discusses issues around a corporate social responsibility that stems from her very interesting research emerging from her award-winning book, VIVA MAC, AIDS, Fashion, and the Philanthropic Practices of MAC Cosmetics, which was published by the University of Toronto Press in 2019. I'm not going to say much about the book because that's Andrea's job this afternoon. Other than to encourage you all to purchase a copy of this really fantastic book if you do not already have one. As I've noted, and I want to mention this again, VIVA MAC was the recipient of the $30,000 2020 National Business Book Award. So congratulations to Andrea on that incredible accomplishment. And it really is the first cultural history of this iconic brand. It's an important book, not just for business historians, but also for anyone interested in corporate social responsibility, philanthropy, business leadership and strategy, and successful, innovative Canadian firms, which oftentimes there aren't enough of, in my view. And just by way of introduction, Dr. Benoit has a PhD in media studies from the Faculty of Information and Media Studies at Western University, and her international professional experience includes university recruitment at D.E. Shaw and Company in New York and London. From 2010 to 2018, Andrea sat on the board of directors of Informed Opinions, which was formerly known as Media Action. It is a Canadian nonprofit organization that amplifies women's voices for a more democratic Canada. Andrea currently works in the Office of the Dean in the Faculty of Arts and Science at the University of Toronto, so I have to be on my best behavior, not get in trouble, where she oversees the faculty's academic review process, and I hope that I will be on my best behavior during this. So Dr. Benoit will be presenting for approximately 30 to 35 minutes, after which she looks forward to taking questions. And we would ask you, if you do have questions, instead of doing so verbally and through your microphone and video, to post them in the chat, and we will moderate them from the chat and pick them from the chat as well. So let's get right into it. I think Andrea's going to share her screen as well. Welcome, Dr. Benoit. The floor is yours, and I will now turn off my camera.
Great, thank you so much. All right, so I'll share my screen now. And I'm going to just turn off my camera. All right, well, thank you very much, Dimitri. Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I really appreciate this. This is one of the first chances I've had to talk about my book in a while, so I'm excited to do so. And as Dimitri said, this is sort of an overview of my book, VIVA MAC, which came out about 1.5 years ago. And for those of you who know MAC, you will recall that it's a very prevalent and successful cosmetic brand. And in fact, it's one of the great Canadian business success stories. It was created in Toronto in 1981, and it's, I think, now the top prestige cosmetics brand in the world. It's a completely original and innovative brand that transformed the global cosmetics industry, and particularly by making this idea of the makeup artist brand an industry standard. Now, alongside this incredible business success, MAC has developed a reputation for equity and diversity and inclusion and acceptance, a celebration of creative freedom and individuality, primarily through its AIDS advocacy with its charity, the MAC AIDS Fund, and one particular fundraising lipstick, the VIVA GLAM lipstick and VIVA GLAM lipstick campaign. So the entire selling price of VIVA GLAM lipstick is channeled to the MAC AIDS Fund, where it is directed to men, women, and children living with HIV/AIDS. Since 1992, the MAC AIDS Fund has raised over $500 million from the sale of this lipstick. And they've had, I think, 26 or 27 iterations of the lipstick since then. But nonetheless, this one lipstick, and the money has gone to local and international organizations devoted to taking care of men, women, and children who are living with HIV and AIDS. So one of the really defining moments for the MAC AIDS Fund was the release of MAC's first ad. This is their first ad ever for VIVA GLAM in 1995. Now, we may recognize this person, RuPaul, from his award-winning reality show, RuPaul's Drag Race. We may see that now, but you can't underestimate the shock value of this ad in 1985 when it came out. And one of the initial challenges in my book was to try to answer the question, how the heck did we ever get to this remarkable ad? So my book, VIVA MAC, is the first sustained business and cultural history of MAC Cosmetics. And it foregrounds its corporate social responsibility around HIV/AIDS. And VIVA MAC reveals that the relationship between the MAC brand and its AIDS advocacy developed historically, and it explains how. So I argue that MAC's corporate social responsibility has its origins in cultural practices rather than a strategic marketing plan. And I'm going to talk about how this occurred today in two particular ways. The first is MAC's unique organization, its organizational structure, and the routines and practices of its founders and its employees, including the ethical production processes that it put into place. The second way is MAC's place as a leader in the Toronto fashion scene at a particular historical moment, which gave MAC the authority and the legitimacy to talk about AIDS and make it the centerpiece of its philanthropy. Of course, layered onto this is the context of the rise of the AIDS epidemic and the way that it intersected with Toronto fashion and other creative industries, alongside also a little bit of consideration of how companies align with social causes. So I'd like to start with that. So one of the questions that I'm asked almost all the time, actually, is what drew me to this project. So as Dimitri was saying, I'm a media scholar, and my scholarship is focused on advertising, branding, media representations of gender, and the intersection of promotional culture with social causes, especially around aspects of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so my doctoral work was looking at cause marketing under the general umbrella of corporate social responsibility. Now, very broadly defined, and I'm not really going to go into this, but corporate social responsibility is about the corporate actions that satisfy social needs. And I was particularly interested in cause marketing, which is an important subcategory of this. Cause marketing is categorized by an overt partnership between a brand and a social cause or a charity, whereby the brand or its parent company donates a portion of the sales of a particular product on behalf of that brand to the cause or charity or nonprofit organization. And the communications surrounding this relationship are very important, particularly advertising. And so that's where my interest as a media communications scholar lies. But of course, cause marketing is also marketing. And the larger goal here is to increase consumer loyalty and build brand reputation and value while ostensibly doing good for others. And so the cause that's attached to the brand or the commodity becomes a distinct selling feature. So I was doing my research, looking at the more well-known campaigns that have this kind of model. And a lot of them are around breast cancer. So Yoplay's Save Lids to Save Lives, which from 1998 to 2016 was a popular one. They donated 50 cents to breast cancer organizations for every lid that customers mailed into parent company General Mills. Another really well-known and popular campaign was the Dove campaign for Real Beauty, which began in 2004 and continues, whereby they channel money from product sales to Dove's Self-Esteem Fund for Girls, which has a number of activities and projects designed to challenge oppressive beauty culture, and particularly in the media. One of the flashier examples is the celebrity-driven Product Red campaign. This started in 2006 by U2 lead singer Bono, and it raises money for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria in Africa by partnering with well-known brands like the Gap and Apple. And they use a lot of like very flashy celebrity model for its very interesting and semiotically rich ads. So there's tons of critique about cause marketing, actually, and one of the primary ones is that it's really just a branding strategy that minimizes the social cause it aims to support and cultivates only the appearance of philanthropy, which really makes it largely unsuitable for true social change. Others will view it as just public relations in a new form. And the really skeptical people will say it's just a cheap ploy to sell stuff. And so while I was looking through these various campaigns, I was kind of surprised that MAC never came up, that the MAC AIDS Fund never came up. It on the surface seems like it might fit into this kind of category. They donate sales, portion of the sales, for the VIVA GLAM lipstick to their charity. They had this really interesting advertisement featuring RuPaul, but nobody talked about MAC's advocacy, even though it began well before these campaigns that I've just mentioned. Now, there's a little bit here and there. Branding literature says, that MAC engages in really successful branding and, best business practices and such. But generally speaking, nobody was talking about MAC in any capacity, whether it was in the branding literature, whether it was in cosmetics industry scholarship, Canadian history, advertising history, Canadian fashion scholarship, queer scholarship, nothing. And so this became my focus, and I did my doctoral work on this project. I pretty quickly figured out, though, that to tell this story, I was going to have to come up with a different way of explaining it. And so what I decided to do is tell it through a cultural lens. And this is an approach that follows a recent turn in business history scholarship. And in telling this story, I recognized immediately, following Hansen and Lipertito and other scholars, that business and the economy are infused with culture. And that this was particularly true when thinking about creative industries like cosmetics and fashion. And this also came about through conversations with people who repeatedly would say to me, "Oh, MAC, it's so creative. It's just such a creative company. Everything they did was so creative." And so I really turned my attention, to looking at MAC through various types of cultural theory. And as I said, I'm going to talk about two of those today. So the first way was to look at the company, but not through the logic of economics or the idea that humans are rational and self-serving, but rather to look at the practices and routines and the knowledges and representations and personal and social relationships between people in the firm and the things that they did on a day-to-day basis. And I kept all of this in mind when I was looking at how MAC ran its business, and also in the stories that people told me about the things that they did when they were at the counter or when they were working with the founders. The second aspect of cultural theory that I use, that I want to talk about today, is looking at MAC within what French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu called the field of cultural production. And for me, this meant paying attention to the history and the dynamics of the Toronto field of fashion from which MAC sprang and within which it operated. And this actually became a little mini project of its own because nobody had really delineated the contours of the Toronto fashion scene, let alone MAC's place in it. So that was also an interesting aspect of putting this story together. So let's start with the first part. Let's start with MAC and a little bit of the history of the MAC, of the company. And, a lot of this is put together through contemporaneous accounts. But I think the richness that I was able to bring to it was that I was able to talk to a lot of people, including founder Frank Toskan, who is pictured on the right. So we have the two founders of MAC Cosmetics, Frank Angelo on the left, Frank Toskan on the right. Life partners and business partners, and they started their business, they had a number of businesses before this. They started this business around 1981, and it really stemmed from the fact that Frank Toskan, as a photographer and makeup artist, couldn't find the right products that he was looking for in his creative work, and he wanted something very specific. He wanted intense colors, he wanted rich pigments, he wanted shades that matched multicultural skin tones that he encountered in Toronto, and he especially wanted a flat, non-reflective, matte finish that photographed better. And so like a lot of entrepreneurs, he just made it himself in his kitchen. And soon his colleagues and his friends in the fashion industry, they all wanted to try these things out, you know, so he was giving them out to his friends, and they were going out into the industry and using them and coming back and saying, I really like that powder you make. Can I have another one? And my friend wants one as well. And so soon there was a word of mouth network building up of fashion insiders, and the business was born. So the Franks, as they were always known, established their new makeup art center. And that's the picture on the right. This is a picture that Frank gave me, actually. And it's one of the only pictures of the counter that still exist. And they set this little counter up on the second floor of Simpson's Queen Street. And they named their new company Makeup Art Cosmetics Limited, which they soon shortened to MAC. So these are a couple of, I guess, mementos that Frank Toskan kept, but they display some of the things that were really interesting about the company. And the first image on the left was a postcard that sat at the counter, and it shows the way that the products were displayed at the counter. What was really unconventional at the time was that the products were individually packaged, and you can see all of the bright colors. This was a time when everything was kind of boring and neutral. And Frank wanted these bright colors in individually packaged containers, and he had them on open displays. It was like a black plexiglass visual presentation at the counter. So not only did the products look different and were accessible to customers, but Frank developed an ethos of diversity and acceptance amongst his staff, and customers also saw this right away. They looked very different from the way the other sales women on the floor looked. In fact, Frank Toskan's staff included not only women, which was the industry standard, but also men and drag queens and gender fluid artists and everybody in between. They were all Black. They had creative makeup and artistic hair and tattoos and piercings. And Toscan encouraged all of this individuality at the counter. He wanted his artists to feel that they could be themselves. He knew he would get the best out of them and that they would be happiest that way. Now, Toscan had a new practice that was also unconventional at the time, which was to demonstrate how the products should be applied to customers. And so on the right, we have, it's a jacket cover of a VHS tape. And Frank would demonstrate makeup techniques, and then he would give this cassette out to fellow makeup artists and to customers. And this, of course, long before YouTube bloggers were doing this. And this was something that was quite different, because cosmetics used to be behind the counter and they would be presented to a customer. But Frank wanted his artists and his customers to really get hands-on with the product and use it and demonstrate how to use it. And maybe customers bought it, maybe they didn't, maybe they came back later. That was fine. He was very strict about not having a hard sell, but he wanted customers to be involved. And he felt that a genuine appreciation for the product's performance was most credible and would be most long-lasting. And so he continued to cultivate this word-of-mouth network, get the products out in the field, invite feedback on their performance, and it can continue to innovate. Finally, Toscan was really outspoken about cosmetic ads that he felt misled and exploited women with false claims about youth or played on their insecurities, so he used no paid advertising. And that's why we would see Frank Toscan's face on communications and any sort of promotional things of the time. This VHS cover, sometimes brochures would have his face. He was the face, he was the spokesperson. And finally, Frank Toscan and Frank Angelo, they owned their staff. And by that I mean that they hired their staff, they paid their staff a high base salary. Instead of commission, they didn't share it with the retail partners because he felt that inspired too much competition, and he wanted to have a team of people. So a little bit into the business, Frank Toscan brought in his brother-in-law, Victor Casale, who was a chemistry student at the time, and of course later became the chief cosmetic chemist for MAC Cosmetics. And altogether, they instigated some ethical production practices that were important and new at the time. The first one was ingredients, which may not seem like a big deal, but at the time, ingredients did not need to be listed on packaging. And they felt that they wanted their products, they wanted to be transparent about what was in their products. They wanted customers to be able to see what was what they were using, and they used the best products that they could find, and they were continually finding new ways to innovate those products to get the textures and the colors that Frank Toskan wanted. The second was that they were very clear about having a no animal testing standard for their products. And at the time, this was relatively new. The Body Shop had put that at the centerpiece of its marketing, but they very, very much stood behind what they decided to call cruelty-free beauty. And so this is the one on the right is a postcard that would have been at the counter, informing customers about what that meant to them. One of the other things they put into place right away was an awareness of their environmental footprint. So in the mid-1980s, this really wasn't necessarily top of mind, especially for a cosmetics company. So they implemented the Back to MAC program. And this was when customers could receive a full-size lipstick of their choice when they came to the counter with 6 empty containers. So you can see on the right, it's the flip side of this postcard, and there's 6 circles there. So they would get a stamp, kind of like a coffee card now. And after they brought their 6 lipsticks back, or their empty containers of any kind, they could get a lipstick. And then the pieces were sent to the production facility, separated out, and sent to recycling centers. So all of these practices that the Franks put into place in their business and in the counter were taken up by the staff and the artists and became just part of the normal routines and practices and day-to-day ways of doing business. And over time became just the sort of the norm. So with this, I think altogether what you have is an innovative cosmetics brand that had really interesting products that were, primarily by and for makeup artists. They were professional grade products. They met industry standards, but they were accessible to everyday man or woman, right? And they were at really accessible price points. And very, very quickly, MAC established this reputation as the most creative brand out there, and it was used by insiders and outsiders alike. However, I would argue that almost more importantly, Frank Toskan established MAC as Canada's first really fashionable makeup brand. And so this is the second way that I approached MAC's history, through a cultural lens. So MAC originated in the 1980s at the same time that the Toronto fashion industry was undergoing this very exciting revitalization. And you had the rise of Toronto designers like Alfred Sung and Wayne Clark, who were known internationally. And MAC's reputation grew as Toscan deliberately cultivated MAC's presence at local events and nightclubs. He would do fashion shows at the clubs. He would go on TV. He would always be out in the industry. So he really cultivated MAC's presence at all of these events. One of the most prestigious was the Festival of Canadian Fashion, which was held in Toronto from 1986 to 1991. And now this was a really interesting event because it was an industry event that combined a whole bunch of fashion shows over about 5 days or so. And it was a trade event. All of the insiders went, but it was also entertainment and spectacle. The shows sometimes had sort of nightclub, kind of subcultural, gritty feel to them. And it was open to the public. So for the first time, people who really weren't part of the fashion scene could go and feel like they were insiders and get a sense of what it was like to be cutting edge. So it was a really important event for Toronto, and MAC was integral to the festival because Toscan and his artists did all of the makeup for all of the shows for all of the years that the festival ran. And they used only MAC products, and they had their own MAC show on Saturday night, which is the most prestigious spot. And they beat out all kinds of other, seemingly more prestigious brands like Chanel to get that spot. At the same time, in Toronto, we have the rise of fashion media. And, one of the most exciting and well-known was Jeannie Becker's FT Fashion Television. And it premiered on City TV in 1985. Now, Jeannie Becker's reporting and visual style were quite a different way to talk about fashion. It was inspired by her experience in music journalism. She'd been a host of the new music, as well as the new genres of videos, on MTV and Much Music. And in yet another way, FT brought fashion to the masses and made it more democratic, and really put Toronto on the fashion map, because every episode began with a local Toronto story, so putting Toronto in the same context as other fashion centers like New York and London and Milan. Complementing all of this was the rise of fashion magazines. So Flair and then Toronto Life Fashion made fashion also a more visible topic. We also had weekly columns, fashion columns in the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star that made fashion a seemingly less frivolous topic. And so what happens is you have the consolidation of all of these creative people and coming to Toronto. Many of them came from Montreal, but you have this group of people now who supported all of the media and fashion going on: makeup artists and hairstylists and designers, visual merchandisers, retailers, journalists, wholesalers. All these people made a fashion community in Toronto, and it made it like its own social universe. And MAC was one of the biggest stars. So this was a wonderful time. If you are someone of a certain age who grew up in the 80s in Toronto, you know it was such a fun and exciting time in Toronto with fashion and the music scene, all of these things going on. But of course, something else was happening which was really quite tragic, and that was the rise of the AIDS epidemic. And this is a really critical aspect of telling Mac's story. In the early days, AIDS, of course, disproportionately affected gay men, and the creative fields like fashion have always attracted more gay men because they are accepted and celebrated there. And so the fashion industry in Toronto was quite small and close-knit, and everybody knew everybody. So the effects of AIDS on the fashion industry were felt quite keenly and quite personally, including the Franks and Mac's employees. They had the same direct personal experience, losing their friends and colleagues. And there was so much silence in the early days and so much in action, and particularly in fashion, because fashion is such a glamorous industry, and the physical realities of living with AIDS are very, very unpleasant. And it was felt that calling too much attention to that would really fuel homophobia and damage reputations. So not very much was said. However, a creative void was happening because so many retailers and designers and artists were dying. And so what started to happen is AIDS activist groups arose. And so on the right is sort of press. It was one of the press releases for the inception of the AIDS Committee of Toronto, which was the largest AIDS service organization in Toronto. And these organizations started forming to help support people who were living with HIV and AIDS. And the AIDS Committee of Toronto itself was government funded, but it relied quite heavily on donations, on charitable donations and fundraising. So in 1987, a group of Toronto designers led by Sid Better, who's a fashion retailer, decided to create a fundraising event called Fashion Cares. And they donated the proceeds to the AIDS Committee of Toronto. So there was a fundraising t-shirt, which you can see on the left. But the main event was a fashion show held at the Diamond Club. And at the end of the show, the runway designs were auctioned off as part of the fundraiser. So MAC took a primary role in this event. They did all the makeup, they donated all the cosmetics, they did all of the hair. They were intimately involved. The Fashion Care show was such a creative event. It showcased cutting edge, fantastical creations and often incorporated themes resonating with AIDS, but translating them into beautiful and creative expressions of hope. And one of the most famous pieces ever was actually the dress on the right. You can see it says Rubberize. And this was created by Dean and Dan Caton. And I think they raised something like $10,000 just on that dress. Now, there was no corporate sponsorship for this event. Everybody was terrified of AIDS, and companies did not want their names associated with this event at all. And in fact, it was not all of the designers who were approached agreed to participate in this. Even this poster, this one appeared in Now magazine, there's no mention of AIDS anywhere on this. Fashion insiders would have known that this was an AIDS fundraising event, but the Diamond Club also did not want the word AIDS on anything associated with the club. So it was here at Fashion Cares, I argue, that the beginning of the brand cause alliance between MAC and AIDS was established. And this makes sense. MAC's philanthropy originated within the field in which the brand existed, and where the AIDS epidemic was most directly experienced by the founders and employees, the Toronto fashion scene. Fashion Cares became a yearly event, and MAC participated, did the makeup, and donated the cosmetics every year. Now, by about 1992, MAC decided to focus its philanthropy specifically around AIDS fundraising. And through the 1990s, the company had been growing and the demand was really high, but they wanted to channel their various philanthropic interests into one area. And this was going to be supporting HIV and AIDS. So in 1992, they created the VIVA GLAM lipstick. And this is the postcard that appeared at the counter. Interestingly, the lipstick looks blue. On the right, you'll see a little red square that says actual VIVA GLAM color. Frank Toskan told me that this was a sort of a production error problem, but he thought it looked kind of cool. So he put it on the counter anyway, and the back of the postcard explained what the purpose of the lipstick was. This is this fabulous new matte red color. He designed it to look good on everybody so that they would maximize the sales. It sold for $10 and it came with a condom. And Toscan said, we pay for the lipstick, we pay for the tube, we pay for the box, we pay for the shipping, and we demand that the department store doesn't take anything on it. That way we get a clear contribution from the customer. I think this is really important. It's a 100% donation model that has never changed. The retail partners don't take a cut. And that has been their business model for the VIVA GLAM ever since it started. So I think this is a really interesting way to present the lipstick. And what was important to this was because this was the only sort of communication surrounding it. The Franks had to, so they had to have consensus with their employees. And yes, indeed, they all together agreed that AIDS was the cause that they all would stand for. And so the artists at the counter became ambassadors of sorts, and they would explain the purpose of the fundraising lipstick. They would give out the card. They would educate customers about the AIDS crisis in Toronto and try to direct them to other resources if they were interested without the hard sell. And MAC's new charity, the MAC AIDS Fund, was incorporated in September 1994 to formally disperse the funds. In that same year, MAC became the official title sponsor of Fashion Cares. The event was renamed MAC VIVA GLAM Fashion Cares in 1995, and RuPaul opened the event. MAC's title sponsorship was really critical because it brought prestige and attention to AIDS and started to encourage more corporate support for AIDS fundraising, both of which began to help destigmatize the disease. Remember, of course, there was still quite a lot of apprehension about associating with AIDS in any way. And by the time we get into the early to mid 90s in Toronto, we have a little bit more buy-in from the major corporations like Loblaw and Labatt and Holt Renfrew and Club Monaco. But MAC sponsoring Fashion Cares in such an official way really solidified its AIDS advocacy by staking its brand identity on this philanthropy. And so this brings us back to the ad. Until now, of course, Frank Toskan had always been the face of the brand, but they decided that they needed an unusual spokesperson, somebody who could really grab attention. And so they decided on RuPaul, who was, of course, a drag queen and singer in the New York scene. And RuPaul's, the announcement of RuPaul as the new MAC girl and the chairperson for the MAC AIDS Fund took place in 1995 in a New York City party hosted by Fashion Television's Jeannie Becker. Now, a man had never been the official face of a cosmetics brand, let alone the body of a cosmetics brand. And you can imagine that there were such mixed reactions. Some called the ad brilliant. Others said it was sick. Others said that the ad represented, quote, an advertising world gone completely haywire. But of course, yeah, the ad definitely commanded attention for the AIDS charity, while poking fun at beauty culture for sure, and the cosmetics industry and the bland advertising that MAC had always rejected. The image of a drag queen also called out the homophobia associated with AIDS. And with this ad, MAC continued to celebrate individuality and creative expression that MAC's founders and employees had long practiced in their business operations and as the center of their corporate ethos. So I want to look really briefly at how this ad looked in the context of contemporaneous cause marketing. And I've chosen these two examples. They're both actually about AIDS from 1992. So during the early 90s, the relationship between brands and social causes were undergoing some changes, and this was quite visible in the advertising space. On the left, we have this ad for the United Colors of Benetton, which was an Italian sportswear company that primarily sold sweaters. And it shows the dying AIDS activist David Kirby on his deathbed, surrounded by his family. Now, for some, this was absolutely outrageous. It was hugely exploitative of living and dying from complications of AIDS. For others, it really denigrated, the seriousness of the AIDS epidemic. Others were just offended by the fact that social issues were appearing in the commercial realm, which of course is very much an aspirational and beautiful space, and this was absolutely inappropriate. Others thought that perhaps this could be quite beneficial and that it might help break the stigma of AIDS. So Benetton, of course, was known for many controversial ads at the time. They put a number of interesting social dilemmas and inequities into the advertising space, really with no commentary, just their logo, and really shook up the way that advertising operated in the early 1990s. Now, it wasn't a clear cause marketing campaign. There was no mechanism for consumers to, donate money to AIDS organizations. But it was an important moment for thinking about social causes in the advertising space, and particularly about AIDS. The ad on the right is for the Kenneth Cole brand, and Kenneth Cole himself has been quite outspoken about a number of social causes and created a number of ads in the 1990s that addressed various social causes. So the copy here says, if we told you a shoe could help find a cure for AIDS, would you buy it? And at the bottom, it's quite small, but it indicates that they would donate 15% of the shoe price to AMFAR, which is the American Foundation for AIDS Research. So promotional activities like this inspired then as now some skepticism about how corporations were interacting with social causes. Consumers questioned company motives. Were these, again, cheap ploys just to generate publicity for Benetton? Probably. Did the companies actually follow through on promised donations? Kenneth Cole, I believe so. Nonetheless, it created a broad skepticism about what was actually going on. And MAC kind of unintentionally entered this new arena. It was not, involved in the advertising of its brand in any way until the VIVA GLAM ad came out. But my research showed that MAC largely avoided the kind of critique that I've just been talking about, because its long-standing corporate focus on equity and its ethical corporate behavior, its focus on inclusion and diversity and celebrating creative expression were so well known. And so when its AIDS philanthropy came out, it was perceived as authentic and legitimate, and spoken by a brand that knew what it was talking about. And so customers and critics were relatively gentle. And in media discourses of the time, the Franks continually emphasized the non-commercial ethos at the center of the MAC AIDS Fund. It was not about marketing. It was not about publicity. It was genuinely, altruistic. They were genuinely trying to raise money to help people that they knew, to help the larger community of people living with HIV and AIDS. And I think this emphasis at the time was quite important, because MAC was by then a really successful company. And this just gives you an example of some of the sales figures that were publicly available through the late 80s and the 90s. By the 1990s, MAC was billed as, quote, the hippest thing to come out of Canada. I've never been quite sure if that's been celebratory or a little bit snarky, but nonetheless, there was definitely the case that MAC was attuned to the cultural zeitgeist. Madonna was wearing the cruelty-free beauty t-shirt, and MAC cosmetics were being used in music videos and television shows. They were inspired by the music scene and 60s trends. So they were really, very, very attuned, and in fact, ahead of the curve for what was going on culturally. And sales started just about doubling every year. So that first year, their little counter at Simpsons, they did about $300,000. By 1989, they did $10 million, and they were already starting to struggle to keep up with demand. By 1990, it was 15 million, 92, 43 million. In 1993, 60 million. In fact, MAC was almost too successful, and they faced substantial business challenges, including a gray market in Asia, or counterfeit goods and counterfeit stores were being set up. People were buying product in North America and taking it to Asia. And they had expanded, really quite extensively across the Bay stores in Canada and Nordstrom in the US. And they had a genuine business problem. So they made what seemed like an unconventional and unpopular and difficult decision at the time, which was that they partnered with the New York-based cosmetics conglomerate Estee Lauder in 1994 with the hopes that Lauder would be able to provide the international logistics channels and help them with the ability to scale up production and protect their copyright and protect their business interests. So they sold 51% of MAC to Lauder for $38 million. In 1997, Lauder bought another 19%, bringing its ownership stake to 70%. And this relationship, generally speaking, was very, very successful. Lauder left MAC alone to do its creative thing, and they were able to have the expansion and protect the business in the way that they had envisioned. In 1997, co-founder Frank Angelo died quite unexpectedly, and Frank Toskan parted with Lauder a little bit after that, after Lauder purchased the remaining 30% stake in MAC for $60 million. And this is where my story ends in my book. But I'd like to emphasize that, through all of this tumultuous time as the business was expanding, Frank Toskan really maintained the art in makeup art cosmetics, continually emphasizing MAC's brand ethos and the high quality of the products and their artistic and creative origins in fashion and culture, while highlighting the MAC AIDS Fund, which had actually raised $13 million through the sales of VIVA GLAM since it had started selling it in 1992. Now, since 1999, when Lauder took full ownership, MAC has become one of the most well-recognized and profitable prestige brands in the cosmetics industry. Fashion Cares continued for 25 years, later partnering with the Elton John Foundation, which is the picture at the bottom is Elton John, Frank Toskan, David Furnish, Elton John's husband, and John Dempsey. John Dempsey is the Estee Lauder Group president. And they have very much sought to maintain this creative, compassionate, philanthropic ethos at the center of MAC Cosmetics. And when I interviewed John Dempsey for my book, he told me that he considers MAC the greatest fashion success story to ever happen in Canada. To this very day, it remains so. So what can we take away from this case study of MAC Cosmetics? Well, I mean, MAC did not consciously engineer or replicate a business model or its philanthropy. And in fact, it would be just about impossible to consciously create a company or a philanthropy like MAC's if you were doing it, from scratch. Certainly, I wouldn't say that there are any particular guidelines or a formula for how to create successful philanthropy or cause marketing, nor would I say that MAC can offer specific rules for negotiating a perfect brand cause fit. But in many ways, that's the strength, and that's what makes MAC so unique. And in fact, Estee Lauder recognized all of those things to be true, and that's why they bought it. It's what made MAC such a valuable and unique acquisition, because Lauder knew it could never create this kind of brand or its philanthropy itself from scratch. And ultimately, I argue that this was the case because MAC's corporate philanthropy, arose and developed over time, based in cultural practices, not a business model. First, defined by its founders and its employees, and showcasing equity and diversity and inclusion in its corporate practices while having a really creative product to sell. And then second, by the virtue of its standing within the creative and vibrant Toronto fashion industry at a particular historical moment. And so I would say the history of MAC Cosmetics demonstrates how corporate social responsibility can operate when a social good is part of people's acts, routines, and practices, which over time become embedded, embodied, and coalesce into the brand's identity. And if some kind of thinking or reflection on a company's current philanthropic stance is in order, I would suggest that it perhaps requires the same kind of deep dive into a company's practices historically to better assess the company's values and belief systems over time, and to ascertain the internal buy-in from employees in order to better determine or best determine the future direction of that company's philanthropy. Thanks so much. I'm happy to answer any questions now.
Wow. Well, thank you, Andrea, for a fantastic presentation. So interesting, so insightful. Really, I don't know what to say. A round of applause just to thank Andrea for really.
All right, there we go.
I know I have a zillion comments and questions. I know that others in the audience do for sure. But wow, that's really just a really excellent presentation. And we are going to take questions from the audience. If you can type your questions into the chat, I will moderate these and everyone can read the questions. We'll have a few starting off with Lindsay Shadia, and I think I just want to rephrase this question a little bit because it's when you sold the company, and you know, obviously Andrea didn't sell the company. When the owners sold the company, did they impose any conditions that were to be honored for a certain number of years hence, such as maintaining a separate identity for the brand and continuing to provide the superb level of customer service at corporate head office for which MAC was known? Andrea?
Not that I know of. In fact, they let Frank Toskan go with relatively few conditions. I think he had a 7-year non-compete, but other than that, you know, they just let him go. And he told me, continued to sort of hang around the company for a little while. He would still go into the shops, and the artists would tell him all of their problems. And then at a certain point, he realized he had to let it go. So as far as I know, that there was no formal commitment. I didn't ever really find out exactly what those terms were, but I can say that in talking to, I talked to John Dempsey, who now is Estee Lauder Global President, but at the time, he came up from New York to manage the MAC brand. And he told me that he recognized very quickly what the dynamic of the brand was. They understood the importance of the makeup artist community and how important the MAC AIDS Fund was to them. And I think that they've made it not just good business practice, but a point of honor to try to maintain that, however big the brand has gotten. That's always been really important to them, and they emphasize that to me. I spoke to John Dempsey and to Karen Buglisi Wheeler, who was at the time the MAC global manager, I think, something like that. That was important to them to maintain that.
Well, I think that answers Lindsay's second question as well, which is about whether or not Mr. Toscan negotiated the terms with Estee Lauder. So that's a great response to both of those questions. And it actually leads us to another question about sources that Tamsin Butler has asked, which is, do you know of any corporate archives for MAC that are available to the public? And I also had the question because in terms of your methodology, obviously you've talked a lot about the interviews that you did, the kinds of discussions that you had in terms of getting that insider information, but were there any archival sources that you were able to access from MAC or Estee Lauder either as well?
It was tough. So I did ask them, and they were very clear, no, we don't have that. And so you know, a lot of the story in setting up the context for the Toronto fashion scene led to local archives and local resources. So I spent a lot of time at the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. They've rebranded themselves now as the Archives. I spent a lot of time there, and I actually found a great deal of MAC stuff in there. They keep the archives of the AIDS Committee of Toronto, and therefore they had actually a lot of archives for fashion cares, and then that led to a fair amount of MAC stuff. I also found a good deal of stuff late in the day at York University. They had in their sound and image library, they had the cassette tapes of all of the Fashion Cares fashion shows. And so, you know, a combination of these things, I was able to cobble together, you know, a pretty good, you know, history of MAC. And one of the things that was remarkable is that contemporaneous accounts of the rise of MAC were actually surprisingly consistent. And so once the same sort of story was told again and again and again, it became pretty clear. And I looked at hundreds of accounts, contemporaneous accounts of MAC. it was pretty clear that the story was being told pretty honestly, and that the things that I was finding were really starting to fill in the stuff before Mac. But there's no question that the best source was Frank Toskan. I was exceptionally lucky to finagle an introduction to him and make my case about my project. And he welcomed me into his home, and he shared his memories and his mementos. And boy, he has some good stuff. He had some great stuff. And I was able to put a number of those pieces in the book, and find out a lot of information just by sitting with him and going through all of these bits and pieces. So the VHS cassette tape and the cover, and brochures and postcards, and he had things that his employees had given him, and cards and appreciation notes and things like this. He was my source. Without him, it would have been a lesser project.
Very fascinating. Did you get more than one interview with Mr. Toscan?
Yeah, I've spoken to Frank, I want to say about 5 times over the space of about 3 years. I really wanted his blessing more than anything. I just wanted him to know who I was, and that I had honorable thoughts about how I wanted to tell this Mac story. And it was quite difficult to get an introduction. He's very private and his friends protect him. But I was able to do it. I was able to find a way in, and he invited me to his home, and I went over for about an hour. And I think he was sort of vetting me to see what it was that I was doing. Mm-hmm. And when I left after that first hour in his remarkable home, I said, thank you so much. This has been just great. I'm just thrilled to bits. And he said, oh, I'm not going to leave it at that. You must come back. And I said, well, yes, I would be delighted to. And so I went back, for good long sessions, like 6 or 7 hours. I have hours and hours of recorded conversations, and he would bring, these things out, and we would talk about them. And he told me, quite a lot of things that weren't available in any other way. And so I passed the test. And got all the good stuff from him.
That's fantastic. A historian's dream, to be sure. And all the historians are like, oh, wow, you're so lucky. That's amazing. And I presume that he didn't allow you to record any of this stuff, though.
I recorded everything.
You recorded everything. That's great. That's
great.
No,
I have all of the recordings. And what was really useful as well after that was that he said, oh, well, you must speak to so-and-so, and you must speak to so-and-so, and let me hook you up with my brother-in-law. And, do you know Bernadette Mora? And all of these people who up until this point had sort of been characters, in a story, they became real people. I met so many people, and a great deal of the introductions were through Frank, and I think he said, she's okay, you can talk to her about things.
Fantastic. Well, we have a supplementary question around sources. Jason Russell asks, has Frank Toscan thought of donating his papers, and I presume other materials, to an archive?
I'll ask him next time I see him. I haven't seen him for a couple of years now, but I did talk to him recently, and I will ask him, because I know that there's also a warehouse of the Fashion Cares fashions. They're locked up in storage, and it would be great to be able to have some of this open to the public.
For sure. Well, if others want to post a question in the meantime, I'd like to pose a question to you, Andrea. I mean, this is obviously a Toronto story, a Canadian story. You talked a little bit earlier about how there hadn't been anything written about Mac. And my question kind of stems from that, and it's a two-parter. The first part is, could Mac have emerged anywhere else than in Toronto, given the dynamics of the two Franks, the way that Toronto emerged as a multicultural city at the time? And the flip side of that is, does that also explain the fact that it emerged in Toronto, in Canada, kind of away from Toronto, New York, Milan, Paris? Does that explain why there is a lack, there had been until your amazing book, a lack of study on this case?
Yeah, so I would definitely agree. I've often said that Mac was the right brand, and it arose in the right place at the right time with the right people. And certainly other people that I spoke to described everything as sort of the perfect storm. I think that we would not have seen something like this. It was a particular moment when, the Franks were ready to try something new, when Frank Toskan, had an artistic vision for a product that he wanted that he couldn't find anywhere, and he just made it himself. But he had help because his sister was dating a chemist at U of T who was able to come in and they could just like try stuff out. And then you're in a city at a particular moment when the emphasis on fashion was really brand new. It was such an exciting time, and there were all of these places that hadn't been available before. And I spoke to Bernadette Mora, who is the editor-in-chief of Toronto Life Fashion. And, she said the same thing. It was all of a sudden there was all of these people were doing all of these things, and there was a place to talk about fashion, and there were fashion shows, to showcase all of the new work of these new Toronto fashion designers who were starting to come out of Ryerson. So all of this was happening in this sort of perfect storm. And at the same time, of course, the AIDS epidemic was underlying it, which initiated this kind of thinking around how fashion intersected with AIDS and what fashion could do about it. And in my book, I do talk about the fact that despite Toronto kind of being on the fashion map with fashion television, it was a very minor player in the global fashion scene.